Long shadows across the Pentagon's courtyard as Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Chen adjusted her dress blues one final time before entering the imposing building. At 34, she had already earned a reputation as one of the most decorated intelligence officers in the Marine Corps, but today's briefing felt different. The weight of the classified folder in her briefcase seemed heavier than usual, its contents representing months of painstaking investigation into terrorist financing networks across Southeast Asia. Sarah had grown up in a military family, her father a decorated Vietnam veteran who had instilled in her the values of honor, courage, and commitment from an early age. She had excelled at everything she touched, valedictorian of her high school class, summa cum laude at the Naval Academy, top of her class at Marine Corps Officer Candidate School. But it wasn't just her academic achievements that set her apart. It was her uncanny ability to read people, to see through deception, and to connect dots that others missed entirely. The briefing room on the 4th floor was already bustling with activity when she arrived. Senior officials from various branches of the military and intelligence community had gathered around the polished mahogany table, their faces bearing the gravity that came with discussing matters of national security. Admiral Richardson from Naval Intelligence nodded respectfully as she entered, while Colonel Martinez from Army Special Operations gave her a slight smile. They had worked together on several successful missions in the past, but it was the figure at the head of the table that commanded attention. General Marcus Blackwood, a towering man in his late 50s with steel-gray hair and piercing blue eyes, was a legend in military circles. A former Navy SEAL who had transitioned to the Army and worked his way up through the ranks, he was known for his tactical brilliance, his unwavering dedication to his troops, and his sometimes abrasive personality. His chest was adorned with ribbons and medals that told the story of 3 decades of service in some of the world's most dangerous places. "Ladies and gentlemen," General Blackwood's voice cut through the low murmur of conversation like a blade. "We're here today to discuss Operation Silent Thunder, our ongoing efforts to disrupt terrorist financing networks in the Pacific Theater. Lieutenant Colonel Chen will be briefing us on her latest findings." Sarah stood and moved to the front of the room, her confidence evident in every step. She had given countless briefings before, but something about General Blackwood's intense gaze made her feel as though she were being evaluated on multiple levels. She began her presentation, methodically walking through the complex web of shell companies, cryptocurrency transactions, and human intelligence that her team had uncovered over the past 6 months. "The network is more sophisticated than we initially believed," she explained, pointing to a diagram on the large screen behind her. "They're using a combination of traditional Hawala banking systems and modern cryptocurrency exchanges to move funds across borders. But we've identified a weakness in their operational security." As she spoke, Sarah noticed General Blackwood's expression change subtly. What had started as professional attention was gradually shifting to something that looked almost like skepticism, perhaps even condescension. She had encountered this before, senior male officers who questioned her competence simply because of her age or gender, but something about Blackwood's demeanor suggested this was different. The key breakthrough came when we intercepted communications between 2 cell leaders in Manila and Jakarta, Sarah continued, clicking to the next slide. They were using coded references to coordinate a major funding transfer, but they made a crucial mistake. They used terminology that revealed their specific training background. General Blackwood leaned forward slightly, his interest clearly piqued. "What kind of terminology, Lieutenant Colonel?" "Maritime tactical signals, sir. Specifically, hand signals used in underwater demolition operations. Our analysts believe at least one of the cell leaders received training from someone with advanced military diving experience." The room fell silent for a moment as the implications sank in. The idea that terrorist networks might have access to individuals with elite military training was deeply troubling. Sarah watched as several of the senior officers exchanged concerned glances. "That's a serious allegation," General Blackwood said slowly, his voice carrying a warning tone. "Are you certain about this assessment?" Yes, sir. The signals they referenced are highly specialized. In fact, I believe they're specific to Navy SEAL underwater operations. Sarah paused, meeting the general's gaze directly. I'd like to demonstrate what I mean. Without waiting for permission, Sarah raised her right hand and made a series of quick, precise gestures, a complex sequence involving her fingers, wrist, and forearm that lasted only a few seconds. To most people in the room, it would have looked like random hand movements, perhaps sign language or some sort of nervous fidgeting. But General Blackwood's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. His face went completely pale, and he sat back, in his chair as if he had been physically struck. The confident, authoritative demeanor that had defined him moments earlier seemed to evaporate entirely. His mouth opened slightly, then closed again without producing any sound. The silence in the room stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Other officials looked between Sarah and the general with growing confusion, sensing that something significant had just occurred but unable to understand what. Admiral Richardson cleared his throat uncomfortably, while Colonel Martinez frowned and leaned forward as if trying to decipher what had just happened. "General?" Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying just a hint of challenge. "Would you like me to explain the significance of that signal to the others?" Blackwood's eyes darted around the room, taking in the expectant faces of his colleagues. Sarah could see the wheels turning in his mind, calculating, weighing options, trying to determine how much she actually knew versus how much she was bluffing. The powerful, intimidating figure who had commanded the room just minutes earlier now looked uncertain, almost vulnerable. He began, then stopped. His hands, which had been resting confidently on the table, now gripped the edge tightly enough that his knuckles had turned white. Sarah could see a thin sheen of perspiration beginning to form on his forehead, despite the cool temperature of the briefing room. The signal she had given was indeed known only to a very select group of individuals. Not just any Navy SEALs, but specifically those who had been part of a classified program that had been terminated years earlier under circumstances that had never been made public. It was a recognition code that had been used to identify team members during deep cover operations in Southeast Asia, operations that had involved activities that strayed far from conventional military doctrine. Sarah had learned about the signal, not through any official channels but through her own investigation into the terrorist financing networks. Her deep dive into the background of suspected military-trained operatives had led her down a rabbit hole of classified documents, redacted reports, and carefully buried secrets. What she had discovered had implications that went far beyond simple terrorist financing. It suggested corruption, betrayal, and crimes that reached into the highest levels of the military establishment. The tension in the briefing room was thick enough to cut with a knife as General Blackwood struggled to regain his composure. Sarah watched him carefully, noting every micro-expression, every telltale sign of a man whose carefully constructed world was beginning to crumble. She had seen this look before, in interrogation rooms in Baghdad, in the faces of corrupt officials in Kabul, in the eyes of people who suddenly realized their secrets were no longer safe. "Perhaps we should take a brief recess," Admiral Richardson suggested, his voice cutting through the uncomfortable silence. He had been in the military long enough to recognize when a situation was spiraling beyond normal parameters, though he couldn't fathom what had just transpired between Sarah and the general. "No," General Blackwood said sharply, his voice regaining some of its former authority, though Sarah could hear the underlying strain. "Lieutenant Colonel Chen, I'd like to speak with you privately after this briefing concludes. For now, please continue with your presentation." But Sarah had no intention of letting him off the hook so easily. She had spent too many sleepless nights piecing together fragments of truth, following money trails that led to ghost accounts, and connecting names that appeared in classified files spanning 3 decades. The signal she had just given wasn't just a random piece of intelligence. It was the key to unraveling a conspiracy that had cost lives, destroyed careers, and compromised national security. "Actually, General, I think the signal's significance is directly relevant to our current investigation, Sarah said, her voice steady but carrying an unmistakable edge. The terrorist cell leaders we've been tracking aren't just using random military signals. They're using codes that were specifically developed for Operation Black Tide. The effect of those 3 words, Operation Black Tide, was immediate and devastating. If Sarah had thought General Blackwood looked shaken before, now he appeared genuinely terrified. His face went from pale to ashen, and she could see his hands trembling slightly as he reached for his water glass. Colonel Martinez leaned forward with interest. "I'm not familiar with Operation Black Tide. Is this something that falls under our current operational parameters?" "It shouldn't exist in any official records," Sarah replied, keeping her eyes locked on General Blackwood. Operation Black Tide was a classified program that ran from 1998 to 2003, involving deep-cover SEAL teams operating in Southeast Asia. Officially, it never happened. Unofficially, it was one of the most controversial military operations of the modern era. Admiral Richardson frowned, his decades of experience in naval intelligence making him particularly sensitive to mentions of operations he had never heard of. "Lieutenant Colonel, where exactly did you encounter information about this alleged operation?" Sarah had been dreading this moment, knowing that revealing her sources would open up questions about her own methods and potentially compromise ongoing investigations. But she had come too far to back down now. 3 months earlier, while following a money trail from a terrorist cell in the Philippines, she had stumbled across a series of cryptocurrency transactions that led to a wallet registered under the name Black Tide Ajo 3. Further investigation had revealed that this wallet was receiving regular deposits from accounts linked to several high-ranking military officials, including one that she had eventually traced back to General Blackwood himself. During my investigation into terrorist financing networks, I discovered that several of our suspects were receiving training and funding from sources within our own military structure. Sarah began carefully. The money trail led me to investigate historical operations that might have created these connections. Operation Black Tide emerged as a pattern, a program that officially never existed but left behind financial and operational footprints that terrorist networks are now exploiting. General Blackwood's jaw tightened, and Sarah could see him, calculating his options. She knew he was weighing whether to try to discredit her, shut down the briefing, or attempt to control the narrative before it spiraled completely out of his grasp. "What exactly are you alleging, Lieutenant Colonel?" he asked, his voice deadly quiet. Sarah took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would irrevocably change the trajectory of her career and possibly her life. "I'm alleging that Operation Black Tide involved SEAL teams conducting unauthorized weapons transfers to insurgent groups in Southeast Asia, ostensibly to gather intelligence and disrupt rival terrorist networks. I'm alleging that when the operation was officially terminated in 2003, some of the participants continued these relationships for personal profit, and I'm alleging that these ongoing relationships have now evolved into the very financing networks we're currently fighting." The room erupted in shocked murmurs. Colonel Martinez sat back heavily in his chair, while Admiral Richardson began rapidly taking notes. Other officials exchanged alarmed glances, recognizing the explosive nature of what Sarah was suggesting, but it was General Blackwood's reaction that confirmed everything Sarah had suspected. Instead of outrage, instead of demands for evidence, instead of the righteous indignation that an innocent man would display when faced with such accusations, he simply closed his eyes and let out a long, shuddering breath. "You don't know what you're dealing with," he said quietly, his voice barely audible above the ventilation system's hum. "You have no idea how deep this goes, or what you've stumbled into." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine, but not from fear, from vindication. This was the moment she had been working toward for months, the confirmation that her investigation had been more than just following shadows and chasing ghosts. But Blackwood's words also carried an ominous warning that suggested her discoveries were only the tip of a much larger iceberg. Then help me understand, she challenged. Help all of us understand. Because right now, American soldiers are dying, fighting terrorists who are being funded and trained by people who learned their skills serving under our flag. General Blackwood opened his eyes and looked directly at her, and Sarah was struck by what she saw there. It wasn't just fear or anger. It was a kind of desperate resignation. The look of a man who had been carrying an enormous burden for years and was finally faced with the possibility that his secrets were about to be exposed. "You want to know about Operation Black Tide?" he asked, his voice taking on a bitter edge. "You want to know about the signal you just gave, about how you could possibly know something that was supposed to die with the men who served under that program?" Sarah nodded, acutely aware that every person in the room was hanging on his every word. "Then you'd better buckle up, Lieutenant Colonel, because the story you think you've uncovered is nothing compared to the truth." "And the truth?" He paused, looking around the room at faces that had suddenly become very pale. "The truth is going to destroy more than just my career." The general reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a secure satellite phone, the kind used for the most sensitive military communications. Sarah watched in fascination as he dialed a number from memory, his fingers moving with the automatic. Precision of someone who had made this call before. "It's Blackwood," he said when the call connected. "She knows about Black Tide. She gave me the recognition signal." There was a pause as he listened to the voice on the other end. "No, I don't. Know how she knows, but she knows enough to be dangerous." Another pause, longer this time. "Understood. We're moving to Protocol 7. He ended the call and looked back at Sarah with an expression that was part admiration, part pity. "Lieutenant Colonel Chen, you've just triggered the most classified damage control protocol in U.S. military history. In the next hour, this room is going to be visited by people who make 4-star generals look like privates. Your investigation, your evidence, your very existence is about to become a matter of national security." Sarah felt her mouth go dry as the implications hit her. She had thought she was exposing corruption and closing terrorist financing networks. She was beginning to realize that she had actually stumbled into something far more complex and dangerous. A web of secrets that someone was willing to kill to protect. The next 23 minutes felt like an eternity. The briefing room had been cleared of all personnel except for Sarah, General Blackwood, Admiral Richardson, and Colonel Martinez, the minimum number required to maintain operational security, while awaiting whatever Protocol 7 entailed. The general sat in stony silence, occasionally checking his watch with the nervous precision of a man counting down to his own execution. Sarah used the time to study the faces around her, reading. The subtle shifts in body language that revealed more than words ever could. Admiral Richardson kept glancing between her and Blackwood with the confused expression of a man trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. Colonel Martinez had positioned himself closer to the door, whether as a precaution or an escape route, Sarah couldn't tell, but it was General Blackwood's transformation that fascinated her most. The commanding presence that had dominated the room an hour earlier had been replaced by something that looked almost like relief, as if the weight of carrying his secrets had finally become too much to bear. When the door finally opened, Sarah expected to see high-ranking military officials or perhaps representatives from the CIA or NSA. Instead, a woman who appeared to be in her early 40s entered the room with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to being the most dangerous person in any given space. She wore a simple black business suit that concealed what Sarah's trained eye recognized as excellent physical conditioning, and her auburn hair was pulled back in a style that was both professional and practical for quick movement. "Good afternoon," the woman said, her voice carrying a slight southern accent that didn't quite mask an underlying steel. "I'm Director Catherine Walsh, and I represent an organization that doesn't appear on any government organizational chart. General Blackwood, Admiral Richardson, Colonel Martinez, thank you for maintaining operational security. You may go." Admiral Richardson stood up immediately, clearly relieved to be dismissed from whatever was about to unfold. Colonel Martinez hesitated for a moment, looking at Sarah with an expression that might have been concern or pity, before following the Admiral out of the room. But General Blackwood remained seated, his eyes fixed on Director Walsh with an intensity that suggested a long and complicated history. "Marcus," Director Walsh said, using his first name with casual familiarity, "you were supposed to keep this. Buried. She's good, Catherine. Better than we anticipated. She found connections that should have been impossible to trace." General Blackwood's voice carried a note of professional admiration mixed with resignation. The black-tied recognition signal, she didn't just stumble across it, she earned it. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "What do you mean, I earned it?" Director Walsh turned to face her, and Sarah found herself looking into eyes that seemed to catalog every detail, every strength, every vulnerability. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Chen, age 34, graduated summa cum laude from the Naval Academy with degrees in international relations and computer science, served with distinction in Iraq and Afghanistan, currently holds one of the highest security clearances in the Marine Corps intelligence community, daughter of Colonel Robert Chen, who served 3 tours in Vietnam and died in a helicopter crash in 1995 that was officially ruled an accident. The last detail hit Sarah like a physical blow. Her father's death had shaped her entire life, driving her to excel in everything she attempted as a way of honoring his memory. She had never questioned the official report of the helicopter crash, never had reason to suspect that there was more to the story. "My father's death was an accident," she said, though even as the words left her mouth, she felt doubt creeping in. "Your father was investigating arms shipments that were disappearing from U.S. bases in Southeast Asia," Director Walsh continued, her tone matter of fact. "He had identified a pattern of weapons being diverted to insurgent groups, supposedly for intelligence purposes but actually for profit. He was 3 days away from presenting his findings to Congress when his helicopter experienced what investigators called sudden catastrophic mechanical failure. Sarah's world tilted on its axis. Everything she had believed about her father's death, about his legacy, about the reason she had dedicated her life to military service, was suddenly thrown into question. "You're lying." "I wish I were." Director Walsh moved closer, and Sarah could see genuine sympathy in her expression. "Your father was a good man who discovered something that powerful people wanted kept secret, just like you have." General Blackwood cleared his throat, drawing their attention. "Catherine, she needs to know the rest. If we're activating Protocol 7, she needs to understand what she's walking into." Director Walsh nodded slowly, as if coming to a difficult decision. "Lieutenant Colonel Chen, Operation Black Tide was never officially terminated in 2003. It was restructured, expanded, and placed under the control of an organization that operates in the shadows between legitimate government agencies. We call ourselves the Cerberus Group, and for the past 20 years, we've been managing conflicts that the regular military and intelligence communities can't or won't handle." Sarah's mind raced as she processed this information. Managing conflicts how? By funding terrorists? By selling weapons to insurgents? By playing all sides against each other to maintain a balance that serves American interests? Director Walsh replied without a trace of shame or apology. "Sometimes that means providing weapons to groups that will later become our enemies. Sometimes it means eliminating assets who become too independent or too dangerous. And sometimes it means recruiting individuals who have the skills and moral flexibility to operate in the gray areas where traditional military doctrine fails." The pieces were falling into place with terrifying clarity. "You're not here to shut down my investigation. You're here to recruit me. Your investigation led you to discover financial networks that we've been carefully managing for years," General Blackwood explained. "Your analysis of the terrorist financing structures was so accurate that it threatened to expose operations that are currently protecting American lives in 12 different countries. But instead of blindly following orders or accepting official explanations, You dug deeper. You found patterns that trained intelligence analysts missed. You connected dots that we thought were impossible to connect. Director Walsh smiled, and there was something predatory about the expression. The black tide recognition signal isn't just a code, Lieutenant Colonel. It's a test. We've been watching you for months, feeding you carefully selected pieces of information to see how far you would go, how much you would risk to uncover the truth. Every document you accessed, every financial trail you followed, every connection you made, it was all designed to lead you to this moment. Sarah felt the room spinning around her as the full scope of the manipulation became clear. My entire investigation was orchestrated by you. Not orchestrated, General Blackwood corrected. Guided. We provided the breadcrumbs, but you had to be smart enough to follow them. You had to be brave enough to risk your career, dedicated enough to work 18-hour days for months, and intuitive enough to see patterns that weren't obvious. Most importantly, you had to be willing to challenge authority when you discovered corruption at the highest levels. Director Walsh moved to the window, looking out at the Pentagon courtyard where Sarah had stood just hours earlier, full of confidence in her mission and her understanding of right and wrong. We've been looking for someone like you for a very long time, Lieutenant Colonel. Someone with your skills, your integrity, and your willingness to operate in moral gray areas for the greater good. Your father had those same qualities, which is why we tried to recruit him. When he refused, she let the implication hang in the air. When he refused, you killed him, Sarah finished, her voice barely above a whisper. We protected national security interests, Director Walsh corrected. Just as we've protected those same interests for the past 20 years through operations that have prevented 3 major terrorist attacks, stopped 2 nuclear proliferation programs, and maintained strategic stability in regions where conventional diplomacy had failed. Sarah stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor with a harsh sound that seemed to echo in the suddenly quiet room. And you expect me to just accept this? To become part of your shadow organization and help you manipulate global conflicts for profit? We expect you to recognize reality, General Blackwood said quietly. The world isn't divided into good guys and bad guys, Sarah. It's divided into people who understand how the game is really played and people who still believe in fairy tales about honor and justice. Your investigation has made you a player in this game, whether you want to be or not. The only question now is which side you're going to play for. Director Walsh turned back from the window, and her expression had hardened. You have 2 choices, Lieutenant Colonel. You can join the Cerberus group and help us continue protecting American interests through unconventional means. You'll have access to resources and authority that no regular military officer could imagine, and you'll be able to make a real difference in ways that matter. Or what? Sarah challenged, though she suspected she already knew the answer.
Or you can refuse, and we'll have to treat you as a security risk that needs to be neutralized. Director Walsh's voice was calm, almost conversational. Your investigation has uncovered information that could compromise ongoing operations and endanger the lives of assets in the field. We can't allow that information to become public. Sarah looked at the 2 people who had just revealed that everything she believed about her life, her career, and her father's death had been a carefully constructed lie. She thought about the terrorist financing networks she had been so proud to uncover, only to learn that they were part of a larger system designed to maintain American influence through morally questionable means. She thought about her father, dying because he had refused to compromise his principles, and wondered if she had inherited his courage along with his dedication to truth. But most of all, she thought about the recognition signal she had given at the beginning of this surreal day, and realized that in seeking to expose corruption, she had actually been auditioning for a role in the very system she had hoped to destroy. The silence in the briefing room stretched on for nearly a full minute as Sarah wrestled with the impossible choice before her. Director Walsh and General Blackwood watched her with the patience of predators who knew their prey had nowhere to run. But Sarah's mind was racing, analyzing every detail of the conversation, every revelation, every implication. Years of intelligence training had taught her to look for inconsistencies, to question assumptions, and to never accept information at face value, even when that information came from seemingly authoritative sources. "There's something you're not telling me," she said finally, her voice steady despite the chaos in her thoughts. "If you really wanted me to join your organization, you wouldn't have started with threats. You would have appealed to my sense of patriotism, my desire to serve my country. The fact that you're leading with intimidation tells me you're not as confident in your position as you're pretending to be." Director Walsh raised an eyebrow, and Sarah caught a flicker of what might have been approval in her expression. "Go on." "My investigation wasn't just guided by you. If it had been, you would have been able to control it completely. The fact that I found connections you didn't want me to find, that I uncovered information that threatens your operations, that tells me I actually discovered something you weren't expecting." Sarah stood up and began packing, her analytical mind working through the puzzle pieces. "You said my father refused to join you, so you killed him. But what if that's not the whole truth? What if my father did more than just refuse? What if he left behind something that could expose you?" General Blackwood shifted uncomfortably in his chair, and Sarah knew she was on the right track. "What if my father created an insurance policy? Evidence that would be released if anything happened to him or to his family." "Your father died 29 years ago," Director Walsh said, but Sarah detected a note of uncertainty in her voice. "Any evidence he might have gathered would be outdated, irrelevant." "Would it?" Sarah challenged. "Financial networks, operational structures, personnel records, some things don't change that much over 3 decades. And if my father was as thorough as I remember him being, if he had the same investigative instincts that led me to uncover Black Tide, then he would have documented everything. Names, dates, bank account numbers, operational details." Sarah stopped packing and turned to face them both directly. "That's why you've been watching me all these years, isn't it? Not because you wanted to recruit me, but because you were afraid I might have inherited more than just my father's analytical skills. You were afraid he might have told me something, or left something behind that I would eventually understand." Director Walsh and General Blackwood exchanged a look that confirmed Sarah's suspicions. After 29 years, they were still worried about what Colonel Robert Chen might have discovered and documented before his death. "There's no evidence," General Blackwood said, but his voice lacked conviction. "We searched his personal effects, his office, his home. If he had created any kind of insurance policy, we would have found it." Sarah smiled for the first time since this nightmare had begun. "You searched the obvious places, but you didn't know my father the way I did. He was paranoid about operational security, even at home. He used to tell me stories about dead drops and hidden caches, about the importance of having backup plans for your backup plans." She paused, watching their expressions carefully. "He used to take me hiking in the mountains outside Colorado Springs where we lived. We would spend hours exploring caves and hidden valleys, and he would always say that the best hiding place was one that no one else would ever think to look." The color had drained from Director Walsh's face. "You're bluffing." "Am I? 3 weeks ago, I took leave and drove to Colorado. I hiked the trails my father and I used to explore together. And in a sealed container hidden in a cave that only he and I knew about, I found something very interesting." Sarah reached into her jacket pocket and withdrew a small USB drive. 30 years worth of documentation about arms trafficking, unauthorized operations, financial irregularities, and personnel records, including the real names and current addresses of everyone involved in the operation that killed him. General Blackwood lunged forward as if to grab the drive, but Sarah stepped back quickly, keeping it out of his reach. "This is a copy, of course. The original files have been uploaded to a secure server with instructions to release them to major news outlets and congressional oversight committees if I don't check in every 48 hours. Director Walsh recovered her composure with impressive speed. "Even if that's true, what do you think you've accomplished? You found evidence of operations that helped maintain global stability for 3 decades. You've uncovered activities that, while morally ambiguous, ultimately served American interests and prevented countless deaths. I've uncovered evidence of treason, murder, and systematic corruption at the highest levels of government," Sarah countered. I've found proof that a shadow organization has been operating outside of constitutional authority, funding terrorists, assassinating American military officers, and manipulating global conflicts for profit. For the greater good, General Blackwood exploded, finally losing the composure he had maintained throughout the confrontation. Do you think the world operates according to your naive ideals about right and wrong? Do you think we can protect American lives and interests by following rules that our enemies ignore completely? Sarah looked at the man who had commanded her respect just hours earlier and saw someone who had surrendered his principles so gradually that he no longer recognized what he had become. My father believed in something better. He believed that we could serve our country without becoming the very evil we're supposed to fight against. And your father is dead because of those beliefs, Director Walsh said coldly. My father is dead because people like you decided that principles were expendable, Sarah shot back. But his death wasn't meaningless. The evidence he gathered, the network he documented, it's all still there, waiting for someone brave enough to use it. Director Walsh stood up slowly, her hand moving toward her jacket in a gesture that Sarah recognized as reaching for a weapon. I'm afraid we can't allow you to leave this room with that information, Lieutenant Colonel. But Sarah was ready for this moment. She had spent the last hour analyzing every possible outcome, every potential move they might make. Actually, you can't afford to kill me, because unlike my father, I didn't work alone. My investigation wasn't conducted in isolation. I had help from people in the intelligence community who were just as concerned about corruption as I was. If something happens to me, if I have an accident or suddenly disappear, they'll know exactly who was responsible. She pulled out her phone and showed them the screen, which displayed a text message thread with several contacts. I sent updates about this meeting to 5 different people in 3 different agencies. They know where I am, who I'm meeting with, and what I've discovered. If I don't check in within the next hour, copies of my father's files will be released simultaneously to the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Senate Intelligence Committee, and the Inspector General's office. General Blackwood slumped back in his chair, looking older than his years. You don't understand the consequences of what you're threatening to do, the operations you'll expose, the lives you'll put at risk. The lives that have already been put at risk by your organization's activities, Sarah interrupted. The American soldiers who died fighting enemies that you helped arm and train. The foreign assets who were betrayed when your operations were compromised. The civilians who suffered in conflicts that you deliberately prolonged for strategic advantage. Director Walsh lowered her hand from her jacket, recognizing that the game had changed completely. What do you want? Sarah had been preparing for this question since the moment she realized the true scope of what she had uncovered. I want the Cerberus group disbanded. I want full disclosure of all black tide operations and their consequences. I want accountability for the people responsible for my father's death and the deaths of everyone else who was killed to protect these secrets. And I want guarantees that the shadow networks you've created will be turned over to legitimate oversight authorities. That's impossible, General Blackwood protested. The geopolitical implications alone would destabilize entire regions. Then you'll have to find legitimate ways to manage those regions, Sarah replied. The age of shadow organizations operating outside constitutional authority is over. At least, it's over for this organization. Director Walsh studied Sarah's face for a long moment, clearly calculating options and probabilities. Finally, she nodded slowly. You realize that even if we agree to your demands, there are other organizations, other networks that operate in the same space. Dismantling Cerberus won't end the shadow wars, it will just change who fights them. Maybe, Sarah acknowledged, but it will end this particular network of corruption and murder. And sometimes, that's the best you can do, expose one evil at a time and hope that others will find the courage to expose the rest. She moved toward the door, keeping the USB drive visible in her hand, as a reminder of the leverage she held. You have 24 hours to begin the process of voluntary disclosure. If I don't see evidence that you're taking my demands seriously, the files go public automatically. As she reached for the door handle, General Blackwood called out one last time. Sarah, your father would be proud of you, but he would also want you to understand the price of the path you're choosing. Once you expose this, there's no going back. You'll spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder, wondering who might want revenge for the operations you've compromised. Sarah paused with her hand on the door, thinking about her father and the choice he had faced 3 decades earlier. He had chosen principle over pragmatism, truth over comfort, and it had cost him his life. But it had also preserved evidence that would finally allow justice to be served. "My father taught me that some things are worth the risk," she said without turning around. "Freedom, justice, and the rule of law, these aren't just abstract concepts. They're the foundation of everything we're supposed to be fighting to protect. If we abandon them in the name of security, then we've already lost the war that matters most." She opened the door and walked out of the briefing room, carrying with her the weight of her father's legacy, and the hope that truth, however dangerous, would ultimately prove stronger than the shadows that had hidden it for so long. Behind her, she left 2 people who had spent decades believing that the ends justified any means, now forced to confront the possibility that they had been wrong all along. The hallway outside seemed brighter than she remembered, and as Sarah walked toward the exit, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years. The absolute certainty that she was doing the right thing, regardless of the consequences. Her father's signal had been more than just a recognition code. It had been a test of courage, integrity, and the willingness to stand up for principles even when the cost was everything you held dear. And for the first time since that terrible day 29 years ago when a helicopter had fallen from the sky, Sarah Chen felt truly connected to the man who had shaped her understanding of duty, honor, and the price of truth.